Hello, welcome back. KennyOrtiz.com. Glad to have you. This video is one of several videos in the series History of the Church and Related Questions. It is part 2 to the video How Did the Church Start? So if you haven't seen the part 1, How Did the Church Begin? How did the church start? You got to go watch that one first, as it lays the foundation for this video and several of the subsequent videos. I've been asked a couple questions recently. Questions like, why are there so many different churches? Why are there so many different theological debates? How do we know what the true church is? And how do we know we're really following the right thing? How do we know the church hasn't been corrupted or the Bible hasn't been corrupted? And I mentioned in the previous video that to be able to answer some of those questions, specifically why are there so many different churches, why are there so many different denominations, to be able to answer those questions, you got to understand two major events. The first is the founding of the church. The second is the Reformation. And like I said in the previous video, I'm going to have an entire series just on the Reformation itself, the importance of the Reformation in the 1500s. And that event really led to, from sort of the mid-1500s up until about the mid-1600s, about a 120-year period, that really led to the launching or founding of all the modern-day denominations we have today. But even before that, to understand sort of why there are different churches or why different people have different perspectives, you got to understand the founding of the church in the 1st and 2nd century. And that's what the first video sort of really touched on. Really talked about the apostles, how they traveled around, they would found the church, they would preach in a particular city, they would start a church, start a group of believers, they would stay there, mentor them, disciple them, raise up elders amongst that. Amongst those people, those elders would be the group of people who would work together to be the pastors of the elders. The word elder and pastor in the Bible was used interchangeably, and so they would institute this board of elders, this group of elders, and they were the pastors. They were the one that would rotate the speaking and preaching and the teaching, and they would handle all the church problems. They would handle the church finances, and they would be the leaders of the church. And their goal was to focus on praying and teaching. And they would be the ones that then go find other people in the church and give them responsibilities to handle specific church functions and church responsibilities. And we see in the latter portion of the 1st century, we see a structure starting to develop within churches. Again, it was relatively informal. It wasn't this really firm structure the way we have today, really. It wasn't that. It was a little more loose, a little more informal. But like I said before, Paul was legendary for this, and Paul began to teach us. So the role of the pastor, those elders, are to teach and to train, to equip the believers of the church. And the believers of the church are then to do the work of the ministry. The pastors are obviously doing it alongside of them and with them. But the pastor or the elder's primary goal was to equip and train the saints, as their focus was on preaching, teaching, and prayer. And so you see this structure begin to develop, and the apostles served over the individual churches and kept them accountable, make sure that nothing crazy happened. And the apostles would confer together on a regular basis. The Roman Empire was vast, covered most of the known world, all of the Middle East and Palestine and what is currently southern and eastern Europe and Mediterranean region, all the way out to Western Europe, what is modern day Spain and England, and huge portions of a chunk of northern Africa. All of the entire region was controlled by the Roman world, the Roman government, and it really is the Roman Empire is the source for vast amounts of technology, information, discovery, knowledge. There are roads that are developed. There are lots of There are several roads throughout the Roman Empire that become very safe because a lot of them are guarded by Roman military. So it's safe for Roman citizens and people in the Roman Empire to travel and trade all throughout Rome. And so specifically the ports, a lot of the port cities and what was Greek at the time, Greece or Achaia or Asia Minor, in Italy. Modern day Italy, modern day Greece, modern day Turkey, modern day Cyprus, some of the other Mediterranean areas. Those ports, boats would travel. It was very safe for the most part. And so this allowed for a lot of the apostles to travel quite a bit all around And this allowed for a lot of education. This allowed for a lot of communication amongst the apostles and the teaching of different churches. And the apostles would travel around. They would meet together. There are several church councils. All the apostles would meet together and would discuss different church issues, and would pray together and would discuss things and would make decisions. And they'd all go back to their individual churches and tell the individual elders what the councils had decided, and they would write letters to different people. And this began to happen. After the apostles died, this was taken on by the next generation. There are three really important church fathers in the latter portion of the first century, in the early portion of the second century. There are Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp. These guys they're the guys that when James, the brother of Jesus, was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and then the Apostle John, the Apostle Paul, the Apostle Peter, when these guys died, they passed the baton off. They handed it to these three guys, and there's a bunch of other guys too, but these sort of guys became the three main guys. I really encourage you to do some Googling and just research and studying on the three guys. Polycarp is my favorite. He was personally mentored by John, the Apostle, and so Polycarp is a guy who was not afraid to challenge heresy. There is a story about this one guy who's challenging, challenging which letters were considered scripture or not. And in public in Rome, Polycarp calls him the son of the devil. And he wasn't afraid to say what was up and call it how he saw it. And so I kind of like Polycarp. And so, if it wasn't such an odd name, I might name my son Polycarp, but he probably would get made fun of in school, so I probably won't do that to him. But Polycarp was a really cool guy. Clement and Ignatius were the other two guys that really sort of led the second generation of the church. And what they began to do was, some people sort of called them apostles and respected them as apostles, but they began to use the word bishop. A lot of the apostles, when the actual apostles, Jesus' disciples in the first generation died off, the early church, many of them didn't use the word apostle, so to speak. They would talk about the gifting of apostleship and how someone who is an apostle functions as someone who travels around and starts churches. But they begin to use the word bishop interchangeably. In the second century was the word they begin to use, which is a biblical word that Paul refers to an overseer or a bishop, someone who's going to oversee. And the early church began to use the word bishop in the second century. Paul and Peter are martyred in 62 and 64 AD, 65 AD, somewhere around that time period. It is after that, 70, 80 AD, where the word bishop begins to come into play. Somewhere between 90 and 100 AD, John himself is the only guy who lived to an old age. He actually ended up moving to Ephesus at some point. He was the pastor at the church of Ephesus. Paul had started that church around 55 or 60 AD. Ephesus was a very rich trade port. He stayed there for almost 3 years. Started a church, planted it for 3 years, mentored people, raised up elders. And when he left, the church of Ephesus was very strong. And it was a trade port. It was one of the richest and most popular trade ports. So people all over the world would stop in Ephesus as a port city, as they're shipping from one place to another. They would stop in Ephesus. And so Paul was preaching at this theater that he had rented out. And people would come to, and also it was the place where there was one of the Greek goddess of love and sex was worshipped there. So people would come to worship there, and they'd come up, they'd visit this church in Ephesus, and they'd get saved. So people from all over the Roman Empire are coming to Ephesus. It was like the New York City of its day. And they'd go back home to their individual cities saying, I heard about this Jesus guy at this church. I got to tell you about it. And so Christianity began to spread. John was the pastor of the church of Ephesus in the latter years of his life, but he also served as a bishop or overseer of all the churches in Asia Minor, what is modern day sort of Eastern Europe, Asia Minor, and Greece. He served as a bishop over all those areas. And we begin to see that the early church began to appoint bishops, men that they saw as great leaders that over the course of their life proved that they were godly men with strong talents and giftings in the area of pastoring and church leadership. That the guys who were current bishops and overseers would then oversee, from the elders of the local churches, they would pick out bishops to oversee other churches, to keep them accountable. And the major focus of the bishops were to oversee the different churches and make sure that nothing crazy was going on.